The city had turned into a literal wasteland, the skyline obscured by a thick gray haze. Everything around him was broken and forgotten, burnt and ashen. Kevin moved cautiously through the ruins which had once been familiar streets and nostalgic buildings, his gas mask fogging with each labored breath. He was wearing layer upon layer to protect his body as much as he possibly could, but he knew it was all in vain. The air was thick with radiation, the ground littered with debris and ash. The nuclear attacks had been expected, but that did not mean the world had been prepared for them. If it had simply been one attack from one superpower to the other, the effects might have still been manageable. But a full-scale nuclear war broke out, culminating in the detonation of a final, devastating bomb. The world had fallen into despair, most people dying. Kevin did not even remember how long he had stayed hidden in the anti-bomb shelter of the firefighting unit he was a part of. All of his colleagues were holed up inside when the first bomb had fallen, trying to stay safe from the attacks. The ones with families could not justify being safe when their families might be suffering and had ran to their houses, or had probably died somewhere along the way. Kevin was no longer sure. It almost felt as if the entire world had been wiped out, except for when he ran into an occasional survivor and realized some of them were still alive and living out there. But surviving was a game of life and death. Those who had not been killed then were dying now, one day at a time. He had been walking for days now, his body aching with exhaustion, fatigue, hunger, and starvation. His mind was numb from grief and the trauma of everything he had endured. He was grateful for not having any family or friends he cared much about, or else his grief would have just multiplied. But there was Leslie. He had loved her immensely, even when she had not known anything about it. She was his next-door neighbor, and Kevin had been finding the courage to talk to her, but he was afraid of losing a friend. He had gone to check up on her after the blasts, but she was nowhere to be found. His heart ached for her, but he had no time to stop and mourn. He couldn't stop walking. Not yet. Rumors of a safe zone had reached him from tidbits of conversation he had heard from other people around him when he had run into someone, and an incomprehensible sign which was displayed around the city. People claimed it was the sign of the safe zone. It was evidently a place deep underground, in the forgotten subway tunnels. The world had moved far beyond subway tunnels, since almost everyone owned a flying car or traveled through the air trains. Or at least, they used to do that before the world had collapsed in front of everyone's eyes. The tunnels were nothing but a forgotten, haunted place where no one went anymore. But Kevin knew the entrance to them, and he was going to give a shot at finding it. This was the only hope he was left with in life. A chance for a new beginning. He adjusted the straps of his backpack and pressed on, continuing to scan the horizon for any sign of the subway entrance. He had reached the general location, but with everything reduced to rubble, he was uncertain of its exact location. The world above the ground was already dead, but maybe, just maybe, he might find life below. It was worth trying. None of this felt real to him, and he still could not believe how his life had been uprooted and thrown away in the blink of an eye. Since he had been a firefighter before the bombs fell, he had been trained to spend his life saving other people. But when the sirens blared and the sky turned red, there had been no one to save him or anyone else. No matter how much he had wanted to go out and help people, he was forced to retreat to the anti-bomb cell to save himself first. He had watched as the city burned, the streets filled with panicked crowds, while the world he knew kept crumbling to dust. He had been lucky enough to survive all the blasts, which had gone on for days at end, but the radiation had spread quickly, forcing him and everyone else who was still alive to flee. And in the blink of an eye, 8 months had already gone by. Breathing in deeply, Kevin continued looking around, his gaze immediately falling on something that looked just like the subway entrance he had seen countless times while walking past this street. Kevin felt a glimmer of hope light up in his heart. The entrance was partially collapsed, the stairs buried under mounds of rubble. Kevin went closer, noticing how, despite the barrier, the place was still accessible. He would only need to be careful. He climbed down cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, which spread all around the tunnels. The underground air was noticeably cooler, offering him a brief respite as he took the first step downstairs, navigating the broken staircase. He could feel the radiation levels getting lower, and for the first time in weeks, he finally allowed himself to breathe a little more freely. Otherwise, it almost felt as if every single breath was bringing him a step closer to his own death. And Kevin was not ready for death, despite the hopelessness. Not yet, anyway. He finally reached all the way downstairs, shining his flashlight all around him. The subway tunnels were a labyrinth of darkness, their walls lined with faded advertisements and graffiti. Kevin looked closely, realizing how he did not recognize any of those advertisements, symbols, or mottos. This was enough to tell him that no one had ventured down here for years now. The tunnels completely abandoned. This worried Kevin a little, but he was sure whatever awaited him here was going to be better than the dying world above the ground. Kevin moved cautiously still, his flashlight beam sweeping the tracks. The tunnels were eerily silent, the only sound being the occasional drip of water and the crunch of debris under his boots. But Kevin knew better than to let his guard down in the conditions he was in. The tunnels would undoubtedly be filled with dangers, such as collapsed sections, toxic air, and if people had been right, so mutated creatures living and breeding underneath the earth in this darkness. He would have to navigate all of this if he had any hope of finding the rumored safe zone, if something like that even existed. As he ventured deeper into the tunnel, still unsure if he was going in the right direction or not, he noticed something even more strange. The tunnels were beginning to get clean, much too clean for what was normal for an entirely abandoned area in the middle of a nuclear attack. And what made him even more curious was the organization pattern in the tunnels. It seemed as if someone had somehow put everything in place. He looked closer, noticing the signs of recent activity. There were footprints on the ground and fresh graffiti on the walls with modern designs, ideas, prints, and pictures. This was clearly done by someone who knew his world. To his surprise, the signs signaling the safe zone were also painted on the walls. This was enough to tell Kevin that someone had been here, or what worried him even more was that someone was still down here, and perhaps they had their eyes on him right now. He kept his expression completely neutral, not wanting to attract any unnecessary attention towards himself. If he was being observed, he could not give away signs of being found out. That was the cardinal rule. His heart raced wildly in his chest as he walked forward, his eyebrows furrowing when he noticed a large chamber before him. It seemed as if a section of the subway tunnels had been separated from the tunnel itself, secured within metal walls. Something about the whole thing was extremely wrong. Kevin walked closer, noticing the makeshift barricades. Just as he extended his hand to touch it, low, guttural growls came his way from inside the chamber, forcing him to walk backwards. A chill ran down his spine at how horrifying everything seemed to be. But he needed to move forward, which meant he would need to cross the chamber. As if reading his mind, a narrow opening from a well-concealed door came before him, giving him access to the chamber, He tightened his grip on his fire axe and stepped inside into the chamber, his mask still in place. The air was much cleaner now, but the mask was like second skin, and Kevin felt safer with it on. It might prove helpful against whatever was waiting for him inside. Kevin flashed the beam of his torch inside, illuminating the scene before him. His eyes widened at what he saw, his heartbeat accelerating with fear. The chamber was filled with mutated creatures, the likes of which Kevin had never seen before. They were grotesque with twisted bodies, as if they had once been human, but were no longer recognizable as human. They were much shorter and almost appeared like animals, their eyes flowing with an unnatural light. Kevin immediately noticed how slowly they moved, but their movements were jerky, erratic, and unpredictable. Despite that, he did not hesitate. He was a trained fighter, and no matter how horrible these creatures were, he was not going to back away without a fight. He had to go forward. If the rumors about the mutated creatures had come true, it only meant a safe zone existed, and Kevin was going to get there. As the creatures sprung towards him, he swung his axe, the blade cutting through flesh and bone. It was not easy for him to fight alone against all of them, but Kevin held his ground, adrenaline surging through his veins. He could feel the scratches against his skin, but the excess layers of clothing he wore protected him, and none of them were able to reach his face or neck due to the mask. He ducked expertly, fighting with his axe in one hand and a dagger in the other, and he did not stop once. Finally, Kevin knew only the last creature was left, and he plunged his axe mercilessly into the creature's skull as it let out an ear-piercing scream before falling to the ground. As if in a puzzle or a game, the door on the other side of the chamber opened, allowing Kevin to step outside of the metal chamber, which could have very well turned into his grave if he had not been quick on his feet. What was happening here? He was extremely confused. He looked at the tunnels around him, realizing how they had once again returned to what they were, clean and organized. The graffiti still remained, now filled with signs, symbols, and languages he did not understand, except for the safe zone sign. But everything seemed freshly done. The walls were clean, and the paint was bright, which meant it was recent. But whoever had reached here to make this graffiti must have also gone through the chamber full of mutated creatures. Then how were they still alive? Kevin could not understand anything. All of this felt like a trap he was being caught up in, but he had nothing to lose. Kevin's eyes widened as he heard footsteps coming from the opposite direction, and before he could react or hide, two men dressed in armor came running towards him. The armor was strange, since it looked more like the body of a robot than the armor of soldiers he had seen in history books. Their faces were hidden behind masks, but they headed straight towards Kevin. He had the fraction of a second to react, and before he could realize what was happening, one of them pushed him on his back, and he went falling, his back hitting the chamber walls. Behind them, the creatures began to growl again, but remained inside the chamber. Kevin's head began to spin, because he had just killed those things, yet they were alive again. But he had no time to consider these strange happening, since the men were still coming. Kevin breathed in deeply, holding his axe firmly in his hand. As the second man came to attack him again, Kevin ducked and hit him squarely on the metal body, and he immediately fell down. The first man was met with the same fate, but they stood up to strike Kevin again. Taking a deep breath, Kevin indulged in the fight, finding it much easier to fight humans than the creatures he had just killed. He pushed both of them away, their masks falling on the ground. Kevin was surprised to see they were normal-looking humans. They immediately stopped fighting, a smile forming on their faces. "You have passed the test, my friend," the first man said, walking towards Kevin, his hand extended. Kevin eyed his hand suspiciously, unsure if they were only going to attack him once again, but their expressions seemed genuine. He did not understand anything about the situation or what they meant by a test, except for perhaps the safe zone lied right ahead, and simply finding it has been the test which Kevin had gone through. Everything here seemed too good to be true. "What test?" Kevin asked, finally shaking the man's armored hand. "You have reached the safe zone. Isn't that what you were looking for?" the second man asked, extending his hand towards Kevin as well. "How do you know that?" Kevin asked, his guard up. For all he knew, this could just be a community of survivors who were living underground, and they would kill him for the supplies in his backpack. Until Kevin saw the signs of the safe zone himself, he was not going to believe it. He kept a firm grip on his axe, prepared to strike if the man made another move. The only people who manage to reach here are the ones looking for the safe zone and the ones who are strong enough to find it. You have come here, which means that you have strength in your body and soul. Besides, your name was on the list, the first man replied, shocking Kevin. "What list?" Kevin asked again, unsure of how he had been caught up in this mind-boggling situation. "Follow us, and you will know everything," they said in unison. Kevin nodded, not knowing what else to do. He was not about to head back after reaching here, especially when the men were claiming he had somehow managed to reach the safe zone. It was true the tunnels were safe from radiation, but if these tunnels were supposed to be the safe zone, he had not been missing out on much. Nevertheless, he silently trailed behind them as they guided him to a concealed doorway in the wall, the surface of the metal covered in graffiti. The door was so well camouflaged that it appeared like a part of the tunnel, and Kevin would have never been able to notice it himself if he has walked by it. The door led to a narrow passage, the walls lined with pipes and wires. Kevin surveyed his surroundings, unsure of where he was being taken or if these men were even worth trusting. But he had no choice. At the end of the passage was another door, devoid of any graffiti, except for the safe zone symbol marked at the center of it. Kevin had seen these symbols on the walls of the freshly painted tunnel as well, and this was the only reason he was still holding on to hope. The first man who was walking in front of him pushed open the door, the two of them disappearing inside it. Kevin could see nothing from the outside, but the moment he stepped 1 foot inside, his eyes widened in shock. He could not understand what he was watching before him. The place opened up into a large hallway, which seemed as if it had come from another time, a time before the blast had happened and the world was still perfect. The hall was filled with other men and women, all dressed in the robot-like armor, engrossed in conversation with one another. They were laughing and chatting as if nothing had gone wrong with the world. Several of them looked up, occasionally nodding at Kevin with a certain smile on their face, as if they understood. Could they all be survivors? He walked further ahead as the hall opened up into an even bigger hall, the entire place seeming like a smaller model of the world above. Kevin almost teared up at the familiar setup of shops, flying cars, roads, and whatnot, as if a metropolis from the world above had been copied down below. What scared Kevin was how none of it looked fake, indicating that whoever had replicated this safe zone had done an excellent job at it. He was both surprised and shocked, unsure of what to feel. "Kevin, I was waiting for you." Kevin turned around at the familiar voice, shocked to see Leslie standing right behind him. Leslie, his neighbor from the world above, the woman he had been in love with. She had the same face and still looked just as beautiful. but she was dressed differently, much like everyone else in a robot-like armor. Her brown hair were blonde, and she looked younger and happier. Kevin was stunned. "Leslie," he whispered, ecstatic at finding a familiar face in the midst of this confusion. "I added your name to the list. I always knew you were going to make it." She smiled at him. "What list is this?" Kevin asked, exasperated. "A list of survivors who are going to make their way down here, in the safe zone. This was created by the military because they knew the attacks were bound to happen, and all the world leaders moved here, even before the attacks. Everyone else, people like you and me, heard rumors and made our way down here. Most people die on the way, and only the most resilient ones can reach down here. I knew you would." "This is for real? I am not dreaming?" Kevin asked, still unsure. "You are not," Leslie laughed. "The operators will take you to their labs and remove the radiation which had penetrated in your system. And then you will be free to live in Messier 105, and we will all build a new world here, only filled with people who deserve to live. I will explain everything once you are healthy again." "And you will be here with me," Kevin sighed, still wondering if he had been caught up in a dream. "Yes." "Welcome to Messier 105, Kevin." Leslie nodded, turning her head to look at the world spreading before their eyes. "This is the future." "It indeed is," Kevin replied, unable to believe his luck. He had finally reached the safe zone,